together. Pull it together. All right. So, as you guys probably figured out by the conversation that you had in your life groups, we're going to be starting a new series, and it's called Fearless. So we're going to be talking about fear. So I want to start off with a question for you guys. And I want to know, maybe I'll have like a show of hands if you think yes, or keep your hand down if you think no. Can you be courageous and afraid at the same time? Raise your hand yes if you think yes, keep your hand down no if you think no. All right, well, most of you guys have your hands up, and I would agree with you guys. I think sometimes if we hear like courageously afraid, we might think that sounds like an oxymoron because they're totally opposite things. But I think when we think about a lot of the stories, the fairy tales that we heard growing up, a lot of times there's somebody who's facing like a dragon or an evil villain, and then the hero has to somehow overcome some sort of fear and be courageous, and they overcome, and the good guys win and the bad guys lose. I think that's a lot of the fairy tales that we hear. So even though there's fear involved, they find a way to overcome and show courage. And for many of us, we probably grew up hearing a lot of Bible stories that were very similar. For example, Daniel in the lion's den, or David and Goliath, the fiery furnace. All of these are examples of stories where there might have been fear involved, but they were able to overcome. And these are beautiful stories, but sometimes we might have a hard time connecting them to our everyday lives, because I don't know about you guys, but I don't on a daily basis face real lions or the threat of being thrown into a fiery furnace. Does anybody experience that on a daily basis? If you put your hand up, I'm guessing you're lying right now. So it's probably not something we face on a daily basis, but in this series, we're going to kind of have a theme verse, or a main verse that we're going to be coming back to a lot. And that's 1 John 4:18, which says, "There's no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear." And it's a really beautiful verse, but it might need a little bit of breaking down. If this chair is going to be a distraction, I'm going to take it away. Okay? Perfect. All right. So when we're talking about fear, it's helpful for us to divide it into two different categories. Okay? So physical fears and emotional fears are two different fears that we're going to talk about. And so to start, I want to talk about physical fears. So you guys maybe had this question in your life group time, and you got to share some of the things that you're afraid of. Maybe it's heights, maybe it's spiders or snakes or small spaces or public speaking or flying. Some of you guys shout out, what are some of the fears that you guys shared? Any kind of bug? Yes. That's terrifying when you knock something over in the shower. All right. Hey, what else? What are some other fears that you guys shared? Snakes? Darkness? What else? Ice skating? All right, so we got some fears. People, that could be a very real fear. Now I want to tell you guys about my fear, okay? It's not something that anybody has mentioned yet tonight. And to tell you about my fear, I got to explain to you a little bit why I'm afraid of this thing, because otherwise it doesn't make a whole lot of sense and people laugh at me. And it's possible you guys will still laugh at me, but it's fine. It's fine. So, there was one time, I think I would have been the summer between my sophomore and junior year, so between 10th and 11th grade. And as I do in summer, I was cruising driving in my car. My sister and her friend were in the back seat because we were coming back from like a baseball game or something like that. Anyways, it's summer, so of course I'm rolling with my windows down. I got the music going. It was a great old time. So I'm just like going down the road, and then all of a sudden, poof, I was like, I think someone just threw something into my car. I was like, what in the world? And it like hit my foot, and I'm like, there's something on my foot. And then it starts moving. And I'm like, okay, there is something in my car and it's moving on. And all this is happening like in a very short amount of time. And then, before I know it, it's up on my dashboard. Staring me in the face is a bird that had dive-bombed my car, flew in, hit me in the feet, flew up to the dashboard, like pinballed across, and flew out the other window. I found feathers in my car for months after this. So if you ask me, what are you afraid of? I'm not going to say snakes. I'm not going to say spiders. I'm not going to say public speaking. I'm not even going to say death. I'm going to say birds. If given a choice, I would rather come face to face with a snake than a bird. That is how deep my fear goes. Maybe it's a little unrealistic, but man, birds are unpredictable. So that is my fear. Now, when we have these fears, a lot of our physical fears that we have, like snakes or spiders or darkness or birds, they're there because they're physically keeping us safe from something. Like there's logic to why we're afraid of this. Like if somebody asks you, why are you afraid of fill in the blank, like you could probably tell them why. Because they pose some sort of physical danger to you, right? Whether it makes sense to other people or not, in your mind, there is something that you just can't get over about it. So if you're afraid of heights, you might be scared to walk across a really, really high up bridge. And even though you watch other people walk across it, and they have no problem, and you know, looking at the bridge, okay, it will hold my weight, there's something still in your mind that's holding you back, that's keeping you from facing that fear. And being afraid is honestly one of the most human responses that we can have. It's actually a developmental response designed to keep us alive, to keep us breathing, to keep us safe. If you face a bear in the woods, like your fear that kicks in is to keep you safe from the bear. So it's normal for us to have fears, and it's usually smart to acknowledge those fears because often they'll keep us safe. However, the same fear that keeps us safe can also keep us sidelined in life. If I decided, because I'm terrified of birds, I'm never going to step foot outside again, I'd miss out on a lot in life. And so we have to acknowledge our fears, but we can't let them sideline us. And it can be especially damaging when we let our emotional fears sideline us. So emotional fears are things like a fear of rejection or abandonment, when we fear humiliation or making a fool of ourselves in front of other people. Maybe it's a fear of relationships or a fear of not being valued by other people. These are all different emotional fears that we face. And again, we usually develop these fears because of something that has happened before, and it's a response to try and protect us. So maybe you've experienced rejection before, and it stopped you from pursuing friendships. Or maybe you've told a friend a secret, trusting them that they'd keep it to themselves, and they broke that trust. Then it might be hard. You're faced with that fear of being vulnerable to other people again. So these fears, if we let them, can lead to isolation and a feeling of worthlessness if we let them. These are the fears that we don't necessarily wear on our sleeves. We're not willing to just talk about them in the way that maybe we're willing to acknowledge our fear of snakes or spiders or heights or birds. A lot of the times, we even are scared or unwilling to acknowledge these emotional fears to ourselves, and we hide them deep down inside of us. So what happens when we are put in situations where we must face our fears, where we're pulled out of our comfort zone, or maybe even forced out of it, and we have to face these challenges? Well, one of two things can really happen when we're in those situations is we can either crumble or we can be courageous. And that's what happened to 4 young boys in the book of Daniel. And so that's what we're going to be talking about kind of over the next couple of weeks. We're going to be looking at some different stories. And this book recounts what took place in the Babylonian exile. So the kingdom of Judah was conquered by the mighty Babylonian army, and they came in, and the troops knocked down the walls. They tore down the temple, and to add insult onto injury, they kidnapped a large portion of the population and moved them to Babylon. So the idea behind why they did this is they wanted to take and develop leaders from this conquered people group and re-educate some of the young nobles to lead within their people group, put them in charge of their people group, but with these new ideas and these new laws and different things. They wanted to kind of enforce their beliefs onto this other people group. And they also took skilled laborers and put them to work building the Babylonian cities, and they really left Israel without resources. And so Daniel describes it in this way. We're going to start right off in chapter 1, verse 3. It says, "The king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and from the nobility, young men without any physical defect, good-looking, suitable for instruction in all wisdom, knowledgeable, perceptive, and capable of serving in the king's palace. He was to teach them the Chaldean language and literature. The king assigned them daily provisions from the royal food and from the wine that he drank. They were to be trained for 3 years, and at the end of the time, they were to attend the king. Among them, from the people of Judah, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief eunuch gave them names. He gave them the name Belteshazzar to Daniel, Shadrach to Hananiah, Meshach to Mishael, and Abednego to Azariah." So maybe you guys have heard some of those names before. Now, these young men had a lot to be afraid of physically. They had their homes destroyed. The Babylon army killed a lot of their families. They were kidnapped and put in a new place that was unfamiliar to them. They were forced into re-education camps where they were learning all sorts of new things, and honestly, probably a lot of stuff that went against what they believed. And then, to make things even more confusing, the Babylonians changed their names. And it might be kind of like, oh, why would they even do this? But there was an important reason to this. Each of these young men had a name that pointed to the God of Israel, to the one true God. Their names had religious meaning. For example, Daniel means God is my judge, and Hananiah means God is gracious. So in contrast, the new names that they were given came from the Babylonian gods that this country worshipped. And so they weren't just satisfied in conquering the city or the temple, but they renamed people to destroy and take away their identities. They tried to conquer these men's faith as well. So how did these young men respond facing this? Well, they took a pretty unorthodox approach. It says this a couple verses down in verse 11. It says, "So Daniel said to the guard, whom the chief eunuch had assigned to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, 'Please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servants based on what you see.'" So, these guys were ripped from their homelands. They were forced into this service of this other king, and their great idea was, we're going to go vegan. Yeah, that's what I do too when I'm faced with challenges, right? No. But in order for us, it might not make sense to us, like why, of all things, would that be their course of action? But to understand their behavior, we have to understand their fear. So because we usually bury our emotional fears really deep inside, we have to dig below the surface to figure this out a little bit. So why were these guys afraid to eat the food of the king? Well, again, they'd lost their homes, they'd lost their families, and even their names. But there was maybe one thing that they could control. You see, there were a lot of specific dietary rules and laws that the Jewish people followed. And one of the ways that they could continue to observe their faith was to continue on in these traditions that they had and these rules that they had with what they ate. So by choosing and asking to stick with their diet, it was kind of a way for them to hold on to their faith. When even their names that pointed to their God was stripped away from them, they were able to continue to consume just a small thing. Again, it might not make sense to us, but for them, this was a way to hold on to their faith. And maintaining that identity would also help keep that connection with the one true God. So for these 4 young men, eating the right thing was an act of worship. If they could get away with worshiping God without the officials knowing, then it would be a small way for them to hold on to that truth. And it was this act of defiance against their captors, and this act of worship to God was inspired by their love for God. Again, they lost everything, and yet they held on to the one thing that always remained the same, which was God. They were filled with this courage and creativity to keep the faith in this way because God's love empowered them to do so. Again, going back to this kind of theme verse for this series, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. And God's perfect love was more powerful than their physical and emotional fears. Again, being afraid is a normal human response that all of us have in different situations. But being courageous shows that God's love is working through us despite those fears. And because these guys were so in tune to God's love, they were able to act in courageous faith despite their circumstances. And this is how it works out. Jumping ahead to verse 15, it says, at the end of 10 days, they looked better and healthier than all the young men who were eating the king's food. So the guard continued to remove their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. God gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom. Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind. So these young men allowed the love of God to give them courage, and God rewarded their boldness with knowledge and wisdom and understanding. And they actually went on to be great leaders and received prestigious positions within the Babylonian court, and were able to continue to have an impact because they had a self-understanding of their fears and were able to rely on God to maintain their connection with Him. And He provided the courageous faith that they needed to continue. Which brings me back to ask you guys a couple of questions. What are you afraid of? Now, I'm not talking about birds or snakes or darkness, but what are you afraid of? What are those emotional fears that you're facing? What is holding you back? What is stopping you? And where do you need to trade your fear for God's loving courage? Now, maybe some of you guys have spent some time around toddlers or little kids. Maybe you have a little sibling. But you might have experienced when kids, sometimes around like 3 or 4, little, like preschooler age maybe, they have this question that they like to ask, and they like to ask it a lot. Why? 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 And every answer that you give them is followed by another, why? Why? And for us, we might sometimes think, oh, this is so annoying. Why do they keep asking questions? Why do they keep asking why? And the thing is, a lot of times we get annoyed or frustrated with those things because the answer seems so obvious to us. But these kids, they're asking why continuously because they're learning and they're developing. And when we ask why, it challenges our assumptions, and the why makes us think. And so sometimes we stop asking these questions. We stop asking questions in general as we get older, because it's like, I know I know enough. You might not think you know everything, or maybe you do think you know everything, or you might just be like, well, I know enough. So I'm going to stop asking questions. But asking questions helps us to develop a deeper understanding. And asking questions about ourselves and the fears that we have helps us to have a better understanding of who we are and how we can rely on God better. We learn what makes us happy and what challenges us. We learn when we continue to ask questions what makes us afraid and why. So the story of these 4 young men in exile should inspire us to ask these questions of ourselves. Again, they were afraid of losing their connection to God, so their creative solution was about food. Something that their captors might not have even thought anything about. But they were honest with themselves about the fear that they had and the fear of losing their connection with God, which allowed them to have courage. God calls us to be honest with ourselves and the fears that we face and to take bold action to move our lives in the right direction. So we are called to embrace the security of God's love. Again, perfect love has no fear, right? Perfect love casts out fear. And so when we welcome God's love and not hold it at arm's length away, He gives us courage to do the things that we are the most scared of. So what are you afraid of? Where can God's love cast out fear for you? Don't let your fear hold you back from a confident life of faith. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for your word, God, and for the truth that it speaks into our lives, for these examples of these men in Scripture who, despite their fear, despite all of the changes that they faced, God, they found a way to be courageous, to maintain their connection to you, God. They were honest with their fears, and you provided for them in an incredible way, God. Your love was greater than any fear that they faced. And so, Lord, I just pray that each of us can be honest with the fears that we face, God, the things that scare us, that we would take an honest look at these things and lean on you and your love to have a courageous faith that doesn't sideline us, that we are able to continue moving forward and be courageous despite our fears. Lord, again, I'm just so grateful for this time that we're able to be together. And thank you for meeting us here in this place as well. I pray that you would keep us all safe until we're able to meet again next week. I pray this all in your name. Amen.